Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together this meeting. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've always felt a close connection to Smith-Kettlewell, in part because my former mentee, Ken Nakayama, obviously has a very close connection to this place. Today, I'd like to talk to you about our recent work trying to see the links, similarities, and differences between deep neural networks and the human visual system. I'd like to first talk about the problem of vision as a hard problem of inference. Miguel started off by talking about Bayesian inference, and vision indeed is, our brains are sleuths trying to figure out what things are. And for those of us here who are sighted, it's hard to imagine what it'd be like to see an image and not immediately comprehend its meaning. So to convey that feeling, I've portrayed here a very simple digital image, except it's displayed as numbers rather than pixel intensities. And so if I tasked you with what possible object out there in the world could create this set of pixel intensities that you happen to see, could you infer what the object is? I could send this home to you. You could write a computer program, try to figure it out. It'd be pretty hard. But if I show it to you as pixel intensities, you may instantaneously have a guess as to what object it might be. You might have an idea not just that it's a face, but who this particular person might be, wishing that maybe they would take the presidency again or whatnot. This is the problem of vision as inference. This is from a grad level textbook chapter I wrote on foundations of vision. If you're interested in it, send me an email. I can send you a PDF of it. It took me a long time to write, and this is one of the images from that chapter. So how is this miracle of vision achieved? We know that the human visual system is exquisite and highly complex. It's hierarchically organized. By some counts, it has 30 plus visual areas. Primary visual cortex encodes a bunch of features that we heard about: orientation, motion, color, spatial frequency. And higher visual areas encode even more complex properties. We know that it's characterized by feed-forward hierarchical processing. There are lateral interactions that occur within each cortical area. And in addition, there's a lot of top-down feedback. For today's talk, we're going to focus mostly on the feed-forward organization, working with convolutional neural networks. But looking at this, how could we possibly understand the complexity of the human visual system, given everything that it's doing, or how might we even begin to understand or model it? It turns out that convolutional neural networks provide candidate image computable models of the primate visual system. There have even been initial claims that CNNs have attained or surpassed human level object recognition performance. There was the elegant work by Dan Yeamans when he was working in Jim DiCarlo's lab, showing how CNNs learn representations that, to a first order approximation, look quite a lot like those found in the primate visual system, and a host of follow-up studies since then that have just shown how promising this approach can be. We know that there are gaps, not just small gaps, salient gaps between the way that CNNs process visual information and the way that humans do. So to give you some examples of possible challenge images we might present to either humans or CNNs, in each of the images I show you, there's going to be a salient object. You may see it right away or maybe not. I won't name it at first, but I'm just put these images up here. In the first two, there are animate objects in the image, things that could in theory move around. There are obviously the challenges of autonomous driving that you could imagine, where it might be hard to see an object. And we do very well in a lot of these challenging situations. Probably the hardest one, you might notice the lion, probably the hardest one is seeing the giraffe in the leftmost image. If you see it, let me know. But there is a giraffe in here somewhere over here, if you can see that. Anyway, that gives you a flavor of what challenge images are like. Now, to test CNNs with a large number of challenge images, it's a little bit easier if we can do it using artificial stimuli. And, not immediately early on, but after CNNs worked with for a while, it became very apparent that they're fairly brittle or susceptible to image corruptions. And these are some of the papers or early studies that noticed that they had difficulty dealing with noise or blur. In the study that we used, we presented two types of noise on top of images, embedded the images in noise, either Gaussian pixelated noise as shown on the left, or Fourier phase scrambled noise, sometimes called pink noise, on the right. And with the images, the cat images shown there, and that level of noise, this would be the level of performance you would see. Humans would be, slightly off of the ceiling, but close to near perfect performance at recognizing what category object that is. If you corrupt it with even more noise, maybe you'd be at 50-50 chance of getting the category right, where CNNs at this point are basically at floor, shown in the red curves. So CNNs are very poor and brittle. They also deviate from human performance. We have a harder time with the pixelated Gaussian noise. Harder time with the Fourier phase scramble noise. The CNNs actually have a harder time with the pixelated Gaussian noise. So that's weird. What's up with that? So we have a paper showing whether we can make CNNs more human-like by training them on noise, and we can get them to recognize objects and noise better and in a more human-like way. But that's not the focus of this talk. I'd like today talk about whether blur might be a fundamental feature for conferring robustness to biological and artificial visual systems. Last day, we heard a little bit about blur, accommodation, things like that. And for the most part, we tend to think of blur as something we want to get rid of from our visual system. It's a flaw in the system. It's the imperfection of optics. But maybe it's actually highly useful for us to be able to recognize objects better. Let's see and explore that conjecture. So one way in which blur is very pronounced from the pioneering work of David Teller is that we know that infant vision starts very blurry for both central nervous system reasons and peripheral reasons. The eyes are typically too long when a baby is born, and they shorten over time. And so initially the whole world is very blurry, and it gradually becomes clear over time. Another way in which we still experience blur in adulthood is defocused blur. And this picture nicely captures that, where the camera's focused on the flower in front and the mountain in the back, I'm guessing that's Yosemite, I'm not sure, appears blurry. And not blur specifically, but in terms of resolution of vision, we are constantly faced with a continuous gradient of very high resolution vision in the fovea and poor vision in the periphery. Here you see the letters very small in the center and larger in the periphery. This image was made by Stuart Ansis. And they're scaled so that they're about equally resolvable if you were looking right at the center. So we're motivated. I'm going to describe to you two studies that we've done in my lab. One was to train CNNs on a sequence from blurry to clear images. So at the end, they're being trained on clear images, just like a standard CNN would be trained on clear images from ImageNet. But the initial training is with blurry images. This was work done by Hojin Zhang, who's now a postdoc at MIT. To give you an example of the levels of blur, it would be like a sigma Gaussian kernel, of 8 over here, and it trains all the way to when they're clear, when the kernel winds up being clear, or there's no kernel applied. And then we're testing it on a range of blur images. You see how severe the blur is, going from 0 pixel blur to 32 pixels. And that's the far right image you see. And after you train a CNN to do the task of face identification using faces of celebrities, whatnot, it can recognize faces very well, including blurry ones. So on the x-axis, you see the amount of blur applied to the faces. Blue is human data. Black is the blurry to clear trained CNN. So it actually maps very closely to the pattern of human performance when it's trained on a sequence of images. It goes from blurry to clear. Now you do the same thing with object images, 1,000 category objects from ImageNet. And what you see is that it fails to be able to recognize blurry objects. It's performing very badly, and just as badly as the clear trained CNN shown over here. So why does the object trained CNN deviate from human performance and it's okay for faces? This is a clear and pronounced deviation. If you look at the effects epoch by epoch of training, when it goes from blurry to clear, what you can see is that for the face trained DNNs, it retains its ability to recognize blurry faces as it goes through these successive cycles of training with progressively clear ones. But for objects, notice how initially it's very good with blurry objects. You train at the next level of blur, it's good here, but it loses the ability to recognize the blurrier ones, and it is poor at recognizing the clear ones. Its peak performance just shifts with each cycle of training. Catastrophic forgetting is happening, and it's losing its ability to recognize blurry objects because it's trying to leverage the higher spatial frequency information to do better at recognizing the somewhat clearer ones. And so that clearly deviates from human performance. And you can actually visualize how the CNN is training. This is the layer 1 representations of the CNN. You can see how the preferred filters become tuned to higher and higher spatial frequency features over time. Now, to sort of ameliorate this problem of CNNs and also sort of capitalizing on the fact that in everyday human experience, we continually be exposed to all levels of clearness and blurriness, we compared clear trained CNNs shown in the top CNNs trained on what we call weak blur training. These were percentages of blur that we obtained from Marty Banks' lab from a paper by Sprague et al., where humans were navigating in real world environments and they could measure the real world blur that they experienced while navigating through these environments. And then the strong blur case, this is to approximate the fact that we have low resolution in the periphery and clear vision in the center. We had equal frequencies here of blur across a more severe level range of blur compared to the weak blur training. And what we're going to do is train 8 different DNNs on these different training regimes and compare their performance on both recognition and fitting to neural data. So these are the benchmarks we're going to use to evaluate the different CNN training regimes. We're going to evaluate them on 2 human fMRI data sets. We're going to evaluate them on 2 monkey neurophysiology data sets, one from Jim DiCarlo's lab, so-called brain score data, and one from Tolias's lab, the Cadena et al. Data set. And we're going to look at generalization to challenging what are sometimes called out of distribution conditions and say, how well do these DNNs do at generalizing here? According to one account by Garros et al., DNNs are very good at learning just what they're trained for and very poor at generalizing out of distribution conditions. We'll see if that's really true or not. So this is our ability to account for data where people were viewing images of clear, high pass filtered or low pass filtered object images in the fMRI scanner, data from Yaoda Xu and Vizuri Pashkam. And what you can see when we analyze the fMRI data, this is using what's called representational similarity analysis. We looked at the brain activity patterns to the different objects, and we see how similar or different the brain responses are to the different object categories. So if the brain finds them very distinct, they'll respond to them quite differently to one another. If they find them to be somewhat similar, let's say 2 different images of say a bear and an elephant, they share somewhat similar shape, then they might be more similar. And we can ask, does the DNN see them as more similar, more different? When we analyze all the data together, you can see that the strong blur trained CNNs outperform the weak blur trained CNNs, which outperform the standard CNNs at accounting for the neural data. This is true for both early visual areas and these higher level object areas shown on the right in this leftmost plot. If we analyze the individual conditions alone, we see that the DNNs also count better for the clear trained, the images when they're just viewing clear images, which is kind of striking because the DNNs that are blur trained are actually doing better accounting for clear trained responses. It's not clear trained, sorry, responses to clear images. And it's actually doing better with accounting for the high pass filtered images, which is somewhat out of distribution. In terms of accounting for data recorded from monkey neurophysiology, you can see that the blur trained DNNs do better accounting for the data in both V1 and V2. And we'll see if this pattern is consistent in subsequent studies. When we look at the data from Cadena et al., this is where 2 monkeys were viewing thousands of different natural images, natural and synthetic images. We also find that it better accounts for the data from those monkeys as well. Now, what's changing about these DNNs as they're being blur trained? Well, one thing that we can measure is their spatial frequency tuning preference. So we can present visual sine wave gratings to the CNNs, measure their responses to these sine waves, and say what types of stimuli evoke the strongest responses. We vary the spatial frequency of the gratings, and we can measure the responses across all orientations, spatial phases. And what you see is that the blur-trained CNNs prefer lower spatial frequencies. On the y-axis is the number of cycles per image that they prefer. And this is measuring the responses from layer 1, the input layer, all the way to the final convolutional layer for each of these DNNs. And you can see that the standard CNNs prefer much higher spatial frequencies. The weak blur trained, intermediate, and the strong blur trained prefer the lower spatial frequencies. So by virtue of training these CNNs on blurry object images, we're bringing down its preference to sort of coarser features, and that seems to bring them into better alignment with the human visual system. Now, one thing that people have noticed is that CNNs seem to be unusually biased by the textural properties that exist in object images and seem to lack the ability to process shape information very well. This is work done by Baker et al. And also a study by Garros et al. Here you can see that Garros made these sort of interesting hybrid images, actually using AI techniques and style transfer. So you can take the textural elements, let's say this is elephant skin, and combine it with the shape properties of the cat, and you get this sort of elephant cat hybrid image, which has the texture of the elephant and the shape of the cat. Now, if you show these to human observers, humans will say, oh, that's a cat. But if you show it to a CNN, the CNNs are excessively biased to label it as an elephant. And so what happens if we present these types of stimuli to our CNNs? Here you can see how it classified each of these different object categories shown in the icons on the bottom. The red is the standard CNN, purple is the strong blur trained CNN, and the higher the bar, the more shape biased the CNN is. The lower the bar, the more it's biased to classify according to the texture of the object images. The gray symbols you see at the top are the human judgments and how shape biased the humans are, the gray diamonds at the top. And so what you can see is that the strong blur training brings the CNNs to classify objects much more according to shape. It's still not all the way up to classifying them quite as much as humans do by shape, but it's getting them quite a ways in that direction. So strong blur training causes CNNs to prefer lower spatial frequencies and be more sensitive to shape instead of texture. We can visualize these preferences by using layer-wise relevance propagation, where you take the classification of the CNN at the top layer and you backpropagate it. Backpropagate is the wrong word. You project down and see what features and what properties got the CNN to classify the image in that way. And you can see that these are two object images. This is a bottle rendered with a clock. Sorry, this is not my computer, and it keeps wanting to do stuff that I don't want to do. A clock image with a clock texture and a bottle and the CNN labels this as clock. It picks out these sort of elements, sort of number-like things, and classifies according to that. The weak blur CNN gets it correct for bottle, gets it wrong for dog. And the strong blur CNN classifies these as bottle and dog. It picks up on sort of these larger features of the object and is less easily weighted by the textural elements. So given that these CNNs seem to be better aligned with the human visual system, are tuned to lower spatial frequency information and more sensitive to shape, might these changes in visual tuning lead to improved robustness for the blur trained CNNs? And we're going to look at this in two ways. We're going to analyze fMRI data that my lab collected for objects in noise. These were participants in a 7T scanner that would see clear objects, objects in pixelated noise, or Fourier phase scrambled noise, as illustrated on the right. And we can see that indeed the blur trained CNNs do a better job of accounting for visual cortical responses in the human brain to these objects in noise. And that's true for when we look at all the data for all the conditions put together. We focus just on the clear images. You can see that again, we see better prediction of responses in early visual cortex, just like we did for the macaque monkey and the previous human data. We see much better accounting for responses to objects in pixelated noise across the whole visual hierarchy. And even for the Fourier phase scrambled noise, we see this better alignment. Now, a final thing that we wanted to test is robustness in general in these blur trained CNNs. And we capitalized on a well-known sort of benchmark to look at the robustness of CNNs, not separate from neuroscience, ImageNet-C. And this data set consists of multiple types of image degradation, including different types of blur, like not just defocus blur, but glass blur, motion blur, which has very different statistical properties. These digital manipulations of digitization, like JPEG compression or pixelation. And then these types of noise that were added, not just Gaussian noise, but impulse noise and shot noise, and these sort of weather-like manipulations. And we don't see robustness for all conditions, but for the majority, I think 14 out of 19 conditions, we see significant improvements in the robustness of these blur-trained CNNs. Again, we as humans are quite robust to all these different forms of image degradation. And so we believe that in this way, the blur-trained CNNs are again becoming closer into alignment into how we tend to see the world. So in conclusion, although often misconstrued as a flaw, we believe that blur may be a critical attribute that both helps biological and artificial visual systems learn more robust visual representations. Blur-trained CNNs provide much better models of neural responses in both humans and non-human primates, exhibiting greater shape sensitivity and enhanced robustness to multiple forms of image degradation. And our finding can inform the development of better DNN models of biological vision and more robust computer vision applications in general. Thanks for your attention, and I'd like to acknowledge my sources of funding and the people in my lab, and in particular Hojin Jang, who helped carry out a lot of this work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Frank. We have time for some questions. Oh, okay, James.
Oh, thanks. I really enjoyed that. Two quick questions. One is if you think there might be any role for super resolution, which is obviously not an explicit process in this model, but if just speculating if that might be going somehow in the brain. Actually, I'll just stop at that because time is short.
So super resolution, I think, is an interesting problem, and the notion of object recognition is sort of a type of Bayesian inference. We're just starting to work with a little bit like predictive coding models or things like that. But one question that people often ask is, why don't we notice how blurry the world is around us? And I think it's when we look at an object and we think we know what it is, even if it's blurry, our top-down knowledge seems to fill in that fact. And so it doesn't feel as blurry as it is because it meets our expectations. The other thing I think that's interesting to note is that, if I go to look at you, let's say I'm looking at my hand, I go to look at you, accommodation responses are kind of sluggish. So in that instant, when I first foveate you, you're probably blurry and then you become clear. And then linking to Dan Yeomans, and we talked about contrastive learning, your visual system may benefit from that through just contrastive learning. You go from blurry to clear all the time when you look at the world. Same thing if you see something in the periphery, it's low resolution, now it's high resolution in the fovea. So you have these links that are constantly happening in vision that link between this degraded image and a clear impression when you foveate it. And I think that actually has a fundamental role in training up our visual systems to be robust.
Oops.
Oh, sorry.
Real quick. So I'm thinking about work from Jonathan Pillow's group where they use something they call gaudy images, which are just, they've exaggerated the contrast of all the images, and they found training CNNs on that, improved prediction for V1 spiking data. And I'm wondering, what images are you blurring? Is it the ImageNet data set? And if it is, could this not just be getting rid of some of the compression artifacts that are known to exist in that data set?
It's not just getting rid of the compression artifacts, although that is worth noting that there are compression artifacts. Like, so you see the difference between the strong blur trained CNN and the weak blur trained CNN. So if there were compression artifacts, that difference would not be as salient. If you add in just one extra blur level in addition to the other ones, it shifts the performance. So it's not just a compression artifact. I'm not familiar with the gaudy train thing, but yeah, I'd be happy to chat more in the discussion session about that.
Okay, just briefly. So do you think of the blur as like basically adding like a retina to the model? And if so, do you think like a more detailed model of the retina will help, even beyond just the effect of blur, but toward other effects that are, like there's a lot of stuff going on the retina. So
yeah, it's a little bit like adding a retinal component to the model. I think there's more to it than that too. So I think one problem with CNNs is that they're very good at learning to do the classification task, which is a little bit arbitrary. And as big as ImageNet is, it's not big enough to teach CNNs not to use some cheap tricks to get the answer right. And I think that's why they're textually biased. Kind of like if you can take like CNNs and you can shuffle a bunch of labels around, it can still have the capacity to learn arbitrary categories. I feel like the CNNs are learning certain things that it shouldn't be. And so the blur helps it. The blur also makes the task just harder so that, like there are a million ways in which you could tell these two images apart, or this image that say it's an elephant from all the other images. But once you add blur to it, it's making the task harder where it can't just be based on the texture. And so that's actually really forcing it to use some shape information, I think. At least that's my understanding as far as we've gotten. Yeah.
Okay, so this is coming from a person who hasn't used CNNs at all, but so it seems like these networks are representing the image at various scales. So what if rather than using weak or strong blur, you just kind of enforced consistency across all scales so that whatever the interpretation was, it would have to be consistent across scale?
I think that's an interesting question. We haven't done that. I mean, for people who work with CNNs, it is true that they tend to learn what you show them. So if you show them a bunch of objects now at a very different size, they will fail to recognize that object. People have this notion that, CNNs have this certain invariant like properties, but they actually learn quite stereotyped things. Now, whether that would be sufficient to solve the shape bias problem, I'm not sure it would, because for the full size images, it's recognizing the object and it's textually biased. Now, if you make it smaller and smaller and smaller, I guess it would have to learn the global shape at a small size, but it would probably fail to generalize that to the global shape at a large size, would be my guess. But again, we haven't done that.
Thank you so much, Frank.